You've really presented me with a dilemma now because I want to go in both directions. As many of you may know, I chair the Department of Human Services Appropriations Committee. I'm vice chair of the Policy Committee. And I chose those committees when I came to Lansing because I care so deeply about children and families. And so your work is directly related to what we do here. But also, I'm a soldier. And I say that not because I'm still in the Army. I was honorably discharged many, many years ago. But I went in as a young man, went to Vietnam. I wasn't married at the time, and I think that's was fortunate in my case. But I do know of some that came back from that situation, and it can be a very traumatic time.
Right.
I think back in those days, and for some of our younger listeners, this all may seem like history, but for those closer to my age, it was a very acute experience, I think, for all of us. And I think there was something quite different before when one went into the Army and went into or the armed services and went into an area of conflict. They may experience a time of going overseas and then a time of coming back. In that situation, we were flown over, could fly back in a day, come from a war zone where you're supposed to act a certain way, then come back where you're supposed to be much nicer and a lot less violent, and some could not make that transition. And so you deal with, Adrian, with military personnel. I mean, we have conflicts now, recent tragic accounts of military service personnel coming home and having significant problems readjusting. What kind of reunion supports do you provide? Do you work with the veterans organizations? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, I think you already described it very well, Senator, when you talked about coming literally from a war zone where you're alert and watching for the next danger to kind of a civilian environment, which, the veterans I work with talk about kind of being more like Disney World, kind of, it's pretty safe here and secure, not in, I mean, certainly there's always danger, but just compared to a combat zone. So that's a pretty big transition. And one of the things that this has been getting a lot more press in this war, at least, is post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and more recently suicide has been getting a lot of press because unfortunately, compared to the general public, more veterans are using suicide or suicide attempts. So that's obviously very troubling. And Secretary Gates actually did a talk yesterday on suicide in the military and named relationship distress as being the #1 reason for suicide in the military because I think some of the issues that you're talking about is that you have to come back and then reconnect with a family system. Our research is showing that families are also stressed with their own stresses, So when if you're living like a single parent for a year, then when the car breaks down or when the water heater goes out, maybe things that if there's two parents there are not that difficult to deal with. But when you're on your own and you have young children and a job and maybe not as much support as you want, those can be very stressful situations. So we work with the National Guard, which has its own unique situation because these veterans go back to work in an economy that doesn't have a lot of jobs, and so it's just I think we're worried about stresses upon stresses upon stresses for families because if someone's at war, it impacts the whole family. It impacts the children, the parents, grandparents, everyone. Or if someone loses their job, it impacts the whole family. So I can talk for a long time about it.
No, that's very, very good to discuss that because I don't know that everyone thinks that way. We have young men and women now who are going off and serving our country and serving us. When they come back, certainly we thank them, and we should. But I don't know that everyone understands the kind of more hidden problems that can be taking place, the hidden stresses, strains on those who are coming back and who have served. quite frankly, when I came back from Vietnam, I remember working in human services and sometime later, but that whole issue of post-traumatic stress syndrome was just starting to bubble to the surface.
Right.
And now I think people understand that it really does take place. And I always say, I thank God that I came back, and I mean that, I'm very thankful. I came back healthy and whole, but some came back and they looked healthy and whole, but perhaps inside they were dealing with some very strong conflicts. How do they change? How do they become acclimated? The stresses of being in a war zone are so heavy. You know, not trusting, looking out for yourself, and even sometimes having to take lives.
Right.
And then to come back and have to deal with everything in a different way. Right. Plus the economic problems, as you mentioned, that can be very difficult.
Very.
So I think it's important to talk about.
Yeah, very much so. You know, actually, I'm amazed by how resilient soldiers are. I mean, very resilient. You know, and their families. So these are a very resilient group of people. You know, I think one of the things that I am struck by, though, and sometimes we talk about the meaning of deployment and what it means. I think some of the hardest things are when a soldier deploys to serve his or her country, and then comes home and the marriage is having some problems, or he or she can't get a job, and I think then it kind of it puts the whole deployment into a different perspective. And I think that's some of the hardest, kind of more kind of philosophical discussions we talk about, is kind of the meaning of war, especially when you come back and then you have to deal with some difficult personal situations. So
certainly, and I know that we have limited time, and I'm going to talk about other things. No, you're doing fine. It's me. But it's hard for me to move from this topic without saying something. I think that one of the things we didn't say very well as a country to some of our Vietnam veterans that came back was thank you.
Yeah.
In fact, there are many Vietnam veterans that wouldn't even talk about the issue because it was so unpopular.
Yes.
I heard of two guys working in a factory. They worked together for 10, 12 years. Both served in Vietnam. They never mentioned it to each other because it was just not welcomed.
Right.
And I spoke at an event and asked the Vietnam veterans, some of them who were having troubles finding a place to stay and may not be doing as well, may not look as nice as we do, but I had them stand up and I said, we're just going to applaud them for 3 minutes and just really let them feel our welcome. And you should have seen those folks whose heads were bent down stand up and put their chest out and receive that thank you. And I just think we need to do that more.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing that. We work with actually several Vietnam vets who help us with the current war, and they're unbelievable. And you know, they always talk about how hard it was to come home and not be thanked or feel unappreciated.
Yes.
Then kind of it forces them to be silent, you know, which I think in terms of us as therapists, you know, we want people to be able to talk about what's going on inside.
Very difficult.
You know.
Sure.
So anyway.
Absolutely. No, that's great. Kathleen, as I said, I'd share the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee and the Department of Human Services, and I'm Vice Chair of the Standing Committee, the Policy Committee. I see difficulties in families today, and I mentioned sort of my background and why I started the Healthy Marriages Grand Rapids effort. And so this has been a very important issue to me. Do you work with individuals, or do individuals in your field work with Michigan families who are in our child welfare system? I mean, obviously you do. Can you tell us about that a little bit more and some of the stressors there? Because obviously different kinds of issues, especially those dealing with those economic issues as well.
Absolutely. The department that Adrian and I both work in at Michigan State, we have a clinic called the Family and Child Clinic, and we have a contract with the Department of Human Services. So oftentimes we'll get referred cases from child welfare in which they're trying to reunify families where there's been some sort of substantiated maltreatment and the children have been placed in foster care, and the goal is reunifying the children with their parents. So we do a lot of work with the families in that respect, getting them ready for reunification, trying to see if it is indeed a safe environment for the children. And one of the things that I found, which I don't know if it's just particular to the mid-Michigan area, but it's very difficult for some of the caseworkers